Sometimes an empath doesn't lose to the world, they quietly surrender themselves. Not because they're weak, but because an ancient program lives within them: if I'm too visible, people will stop loving me. And success begins to feel like a danger, like a light that exposes. They want to move forward, but every step seems to drag someone's shadow with them. Mom's fears. Dad's disappointments. Other people's expectations, absorbed in childhood. Jung called these complexes autonomous pieces of the psyche that live their own lives. An empath is especially vulnerable to them because from childhood they learn to feel not themselves, but the atmosphere around them. And then the first invisible mindset emerges: I can't be better than others, it will hurt. And they begin to diminish themselves. They joke about their achievements. They put off important steps. They doubt their obvious talent. Don't you notice? It's not laziness. It's loyalty to the old emotional system of the family. Another program sounds softer but more dangerous: my job is to support, not to shine. The empath becomes a backdrop in their own life. They know how to be safe, comfortable, and understandable. But success requires a different state, inner permission to occupy space. And anxiety rises within, as if they are doing something forbidden. Sometimes sabotage disguises itself as spirituality. I don't care about money, the most important thing is soul, material things are base. But honestly, underneath this often lies a fear of power. Because power changes the balance of roles. And the empath is used to surviving through harmonization, not through manifestation. There is an even deeper attitude, the mindset of a child who became an emotional adult too early: if I relax, everything will fall apart. Such a person doesn't allow themselves success, because success is trust in life. And trust seems naive. So they create obstacles themselves to confirm the old worldview: you see, you can't let go of control. Jung spoke of the shadow, that part of us that we don't acknowledge. An empath's shadow often harbors ambition, strength, even aggression. But they've repressed them to be good. And then the shadow begins to surface: forgotten deadlines, accidental mistakes, sudden doubts before an important step. It's as if the psyche whispers, reclaim your forbidden energy, otherwise I'll hold you back even further. Self-sabotage isn't an enemy. It's a guardian of an old identity. It protects a version of you that once survived thanks to sensitivity and modesty. And while you fight it, it grows stronger. But tell it, I see why you were needed, and it begins to melt. Insight comes quietly: success isn't betrayal, but maturation. You're not hurting anyone with your light. You're simply moving from the role of emotional savior to that of a living person. And that's only scary for those accustomed to being comfortable. And at some point, the empath notices something strange: when they stop minimizing themselves, the world doesn't collapse. On the contrary, everything around them becomes calmer. Because their energy is no longer wasted on internal warfare. Self-sabotage dissolves not through willpower, but through permission to be more than they were once allowed to be. And then sensitivity ceases to be an anchor. It becomes a compass. Sometimes an empath is already at the very door where their new life begins, and suddenly feels an inexplicable fatigue. It's as if their body is growing heavy just when they need to take the leap. This is the old mindset speaking: success will demand too much, I can't handle it. The inner child remembers the overload, when no one protected their sensitivity. And now the psyche confuses growth with the threat of exhaustion. They postpone a step, calling it intuition. But if you listen deeper, it's not the quiet voice of the soul, but the anxiety of the past. Intuition is calm. Anxiety urges them to hide. And the empath learns to distinguish between what the heart is saying and what old pain is saying. There's also a mindset, almost invisible: to be loved, I must be needed. Success makes a person independent. And then a paradox arises within: the closer they are to stability and strength, the greater the fear of losing connection. The psyche chooses the familiar, being needed through difficulties, rather than freedom through fulfillment. Jung wrote that we are often loyal not to happiness, but to familiar suffering. An empath can unconsciously return to places where they are hurt, because their role is clear there. Success, however, is the unknown. There is no script, no familiar emotional dynamics. And so they create drama, delays, chaos, all to return to a familiar emotional landscape. Sometimes sabotage sounds like modesty, I'm not ready yet. And this preparation lasts for years. Behind it lies the fear of being seen completely. Because visibility in childhood often meant criticism or pressure. And now the psyche whispers, stay in the shadows, it's safe there. But in the shadows, irritation grows. The empath begins to rage at the world, at circumstances, at injustice. This is the shadow knocking from within, a suppressed force wants release. And the longer it is ignored, the more life begins to slow them down from the outside, as if reflecting an internal inhibition. There is another deep-seated attitude, easy means suspicious. If something starts to come naturally, without strain, an empath can complicate things. Because their nervous system has become accustomed to tension as the norm. Calm feels like emptiness. And emptiness is frightening. And then they unconsciously create obstacles to regaining that familiar intensity, not understanding that maturity isn't a constant storm, but the ability to remain in silence without feeling lost. At some point, the understanding comes, all these attitudes once protected. They helped them survive in an emotionally challenging environment. But now they're not a guard, they're a cage. And the empath begins to say new words to themselves, not out loud, but internally, I can be strong and loved at the same time. And then a shift occurs, success ceases to be a threat to the relationship, but becomes its new quality. Sensitivity no longer leads to self-deprecation, but to careful choices of environment, people, and projects. Self-sabotage doesn't disappear overnight. But it loses its power when it's seen. The light of awareness does what willpower hasn't been able to for years, it transforms the inner enemy into an old guardian, one that can be thanked and released. And then the path forward no longer feels like a betrayal of the past. It becomes a return to oneself. Sometimes an empath already understands their patterns, sees their attitudes, and can even explain them to others, but at the most crucial moment, they still seem to accidentally fall off the wagon. And then a new trap is born, if I understand everything but don't change, there's something wrong with me. This is shame for one's own depth. But the psyche is not a mechanism. It unfolds in layers, like a night in which the stars don't immediately shine. A silent vow often lives within them, I will not become like those who hurt me. And success is unconsciously associated with power, harshness, and coldness. The empath fears that by becoming strong, they will lose their heart. And so they remain in a position of boundless softness, confusing kindness with self-effacement. Sometimes they sabotage themselves just before a breakthrough, because deep down they hear, if I achieve this, there will be no turning back. Success is the point of no return. It is growing up. But part of the soul still longs for someone to come, see their weariness, and say, you don't need to try any harder. And until this part is heard, it will hinder their forward movement. There's also an ancient fear of the empath, the fear of others' envy. They're all too sensitive to the emotions of others and know what hidden hostility looks like. Therefore, they unconsciously choose to be a little lower so as not to provoke tension. But in this way, they pay for their safety with their own lack of fulfillment. Jung said that an unlived life becomes a symptom. And then self-sabotage turns into fatigue without cause, a loss of interest, a feeling of, I feel like I'm out of place. This is the soul signaling, you're living a version of yourself that's comfortable with the past, but not the present. Sometimes this attitude sounds almost noble, there are more talented people, they need you more. This is a distortion of sensitivity. The empath senses the potential of others and devalues their own. But the world doesn't distribute purpose by competition. If something inside is begging to come out, that's already a reason. There's also a fear of one's own depth. Success often opens access to even greater power, influence, and scale. But an empath is used to regulating only the emotions in the room, not the energy that can change reality. And then the psyche slams on the brakes, too much. Dangerous. But gradually, they notice that life still pushes them where they resist. Scenarios repeat, opportunities return in new forms. It's as if fate itself disagrees with their self-diminishment. And then, at one point, a quiet turning point occurs. They begin to see that self-sabotage isn't proof of weakness, but an indicator of the strength they've long held onto. The greater the potential, the stronger the defense around them. And then, instead of the question, "What's wrong with me?" another arises, "Which version of myself am I afraid to wake up to?" And this question opens the door more gently than any struggle. Because an empath doesn't break down defenses, they outgrow them. And success ceases to be a leap into someone else's role. It becomes a natural extension of who he's been all along, simply without the internal inhibition of being visible. Sometimes an empath lives as if there's an invisible light limiter within them. They can shine, but only at a safe level. Any brighter, and a silent alarm sounds. This is an old recording deep within the psyche. My radiance can blind, hurt, or leave someone in the shadows. And so they choose a half tone instead of a full one. They often feel more responsible for others' reactions than for their own fate. If someone nearby becomes uncomfortable with their growth, they automatically take a step back. Not out of weakness, but out of hypersensitivity. But there's a hidden message: others' discomfort is more important than my own fulfillment. And life begins to pass them by because they don't choose themselves. Sometimes self-sabotage comes in the form of absent-mindedness. Thoughts wander, focus is lost, energy is wasted on worrying about things that haven't even happened yet. This isn't a lack of discipline, it's a nervous system accustomed to scanning the world for threats. Success requires being present, and an empath often lives where others are struggling. There's also a deep-seated belief: if I succeed, they'll hold me accountable. As a child, he might have been pressured for his ability to cope. And now success feels not like freedom, but like an increased burden. Therefore, it remains potential rather than realized. It feels easier. Sometimes he confuses peace with emptiness. When life settles down, there are no dramas, everything is going smoothly, a strange restlessness arises within. The psyche, accustomed to emotional storms, doesn't recognize stability. And then he unconsciously triggers old scenarios to recapture the familiar intensity. There's also the attitude of empathic guilt: how can I rejoice when there's so much pain in the world? And then his own success is experienced as unfair. But sensitivity is not given to drown in suffering, but to bring more awareness and warmth into the world. Joy is not a betrayal, it's a resource. Sometimes he doesn't complete what he started, because completion is manifestation. Until a project is completed, one can remain in the zone of possibilities, not results. And results are appearances, assessments, the world's reaction. And the psyche chooses incompleteness as a form of defense. Deeper lies the fear of losing one's identity as a feeling being. If one becomes successful, strong, and stable, who are they then? Will their special depth disappear? But maturity doesn't eliminate sensitivity, it gives it support. Water doesn't disappear when shores appear. Gradually, the empath begins to notice, every time they take a step closer to themselves, the world doesn't become colder. On the contrary, those around them begin to breathe a sigh of relief. Because being around a person who isn't at war with themselves makes everyone feel calmer. And one day, a quiet realization dawns: self-sabotage wasn't an enemy, but a way to postpone meeting one's own power. But the empath's power isn't harsh, not overwhelming. It's soft, like the depths of the ocean. And when they allow themselves to be greater, the world doesn't break. It simply expands. Sometimes an empath has lived in internal survival mode for so long that they don't even notice how self-sabotage has become their natural home. Everything there is familiar: doubt, procrastination, the feeling of almost. Almost started. Almost decided. Almost believed in themselves. And this, almost, provides the illusion of movement without requiring a real transition. Deep within their psyche, success is associated not with joy, but with loss. The loss of an old self-image, one who endures, understands, and saves. If they step out of this role, who are they? And a fear of emptiness appears, as if, without pain and tension, they will disappear. But this isn't disappearance, it's a shedding of skin. Sometimes they cling to fatigue as proof of their worth. I've endured a lot, that means I'm good. And then the ease seems suspicious, almost dishonest. But life doesn't measure worth by the amount of pain endured. This is the old morality of suffering, not the law of the soul. There's a deeply hidden belief: if I truly become myself, they might not recognize me. An empath has often shaped their identity around the needs of others. And true expression feels like a risk of loneliness. But in reality, it's the connections built on their self-deprecation that disappear. Sometimes, sabotage manifests itself in a strange way. They begin helping everyone precisely when they need to help themselves. Other people's urgent matters suddenly become more important than their own step forward. This isn't a coincidence. It's a way to remain in the familiar role of being needed, rather than moving into a state of fulfillment. The Jungian shadow in an empath is not only suppressed aggression, but also suppressed grandiosity. The part that knows the scale of their soul. And as long as they call it too much, inconvenient, not for me, life will shrink to a safe size. But there comes a point when the fatigue of their own restraint becomes stronger than the fear of change. And the empath suddenly feels clearly, they weren't betraying the world, they were betraying themselves, each time choosing to be smaller than they felt inside. And then, not an explosion, but a quiet shift occurs. They don't force themselves to be confident. They simply stop believing every internal prohibition. Thoughts still come: it won't work, it's not the right time, it's too difficult, but they no longer ring true. They sound like echoes of the past. Self-sabotage at this point loses its magic. It becomes a visible mechanism, not fate. And for the first time, the empath feels they can move forward not in spite of their sensitivity, but because of it. Their depth no longer holds them back, it gives them stability. And the end result isn't that fear disappears. The end result is that it no longer controls. The empath moves forward with trepidation, with vulnerability, with a living heart, but without any internal inhibition against their own light. And then success ceases to be foreign territory. It becomes a natural extension of their true, undiminished self. If these thoughts resonated within you, please share in the comments what was your most powerful insight. Your experience can help those going through a similar journey. And if you feel like you're being spoken to in the language of your soul, stay and subscribe. There are many more profound conversations ahead. Thanks for watching.